I joined the Terran Alliance forces out of a desire to serve in the military that had saved my people. Admittedly, they had done that many decades before I was ever born, but my people are a warrior species, and after seeing the Terrans fight for us, we had learned to respect them and consider them honourable allies. To join their military brought honour to my family and to myself. I spent 10 months in my initial training. Terrans seemed to love endurance-based training to my detriment, but eventually I was accepted into the Terran Infantry Corps. Then I went to drop school. There were other non-Terrans in the infantry. In fact, by the time I joined, humans only made up roughly 40% of the TAF forces. I wasn't even the only Koollman in my training company. Apparently the Terrans like having us around because of our resemblance to an old fantasy race known as Dragonborn. Though apparently these Dragonborn only had 2 arms instead of our 4. Also, I don't have a breath weapon, though some of my squadmates insisted that I did after chow time. Training was fun. As I mentioned, the endurance training was difficult for me, but other than that, I had a good time in basic training and infantry training. I was lucky enough to be assigned to the 101st Drop Troopers, known as the Screaming Eagles. They were named after an old Terran airborne unit, back when the leading Terran military used to drop their troops from aeroplanes. The method of deployment was different now. Only instead of planes, we dropped from low orbit, and instead of parachutes, our pods used gravitic cushions that stopped them just a few feet from the ground. Coupled with inertial dampeners, a 6-man squad could drop from space to planet's surface in a few minutes with minimal visual or sensor signatures. And the windows on the pods let you see the show from the inside. By the goddesses, every drop was the greatest rush of my life. The unit was where I met SSG Merrick. I still make most of my combat decisions based on the things he taught me. I still base my life choices, at least partly, on what I believe he would do in my situation. He was my platoon sergeant. Specifically, he was a staff sergeant. He was a hard-ass, a term Terrans use for someone who doesn't allow a lot of deviation from the rules and regulations. But in my experience, he broke more than a few of those rules himself, so long as it made sense to do so, so long as it was justifiable. He was quiet. It always seemed like he saved his words for exactly when they were needed, and only said exactly what he meant to say. Like he thought that every word needed to be saved for the sentence it was meant for, if that makes any sense. He also had incredibly scary eyes. As a nearly 7-foot-tall reptile from a warrior race, I wasn't used to being scared to look someone in the eyes, but SSG Merrick had eyes that it seemed could pierce into your souls. It felt like he was looking through you while simultaneously analysing everything in front of them. I lived most of my life after that point on a Class P death world, a world where nearly every species had evolved for maximum lethality. Humans called it Space Australia, and yet no creature's gaze had ever scared me like SSG Merrick's. Despite these qualities, I would come to learn that SSG Merrick was actually the one NCO in my company that I could always depend on. Whether it was issues with my gear, issues with my assigned duties, or issues with my personal life, I found that he was always willing to listen to my problems, and, when possible, would help me deal with them. And it wasn't just me. From what the other soldiers told me, he was just like that. Despite his hard-ass status, he was widely regarded as a good NCO. He had also served long enough that he was only one more service term away from retiring. I was a little confused by this. Typically, soldiers nearing retirement had gained higher rank than Staff Sergeant. When I asked one of the soldiers why he wasn't higher rank, they told me he'd had to face court-martial once or twice, he even lost rank once, but I was assured that you almost had to get in trouble every now and then to be a good NCO. I learned the hard way why the SSG had such hard ways during our first true deployment. It was against the Zanari theocracy. The Terrans were not at war with them, but their allies the Polonoi were, so the TAF decided to lend a hand. My unit was one of the ones deployed to the front lines. Our job was simple enough. Anytime the brass found an enemy battle line, they would press the attack with armor and infantry. Once the enemy had moved to engage, we would drop behind them, usually under cover of darkness. I was excited. This was what I was convinced I had been born for. To grow up in my species, train as the best TAF could offer. And now, to see actual combat. It was a childhood dream come true. It was also terrifying. I had only ever trained and only ever used deadly force at home against my planet's flora and fauna. To think that soon I'd be seeing actual combat. It was a lot to handle, and it was coming at me fast. SSG Merrick must have seen it with those eyes of his while we were in the drop pod. He'd ensured that me and the 2 other newest members were in his pod. He wanted to keep an eye on us to make sure we handled ourselves. I was thankful he'd done that. He must have seen something when he looked at me. He placed a hand on my upper shoulder, and when I looked at him, he actually looked calm for once. "It's going to be alright, Yrrol," he said. "I put you free in my pod specifically because I know how scary first drop is." He tapped Ramirez on the helmet, and pinched Glant's left manipulator as he passed. When they looked at him, he continued. "It's going to be as chaotic as you're probably thinking. That's okay. That's life in the Eagles." He strapped himself into his chair. "Stay right on my ass, remember your training, and we'll get through this. And save the emotional stuff for afterwards. You won't have time for it until then." Then the pod dropped. I hadn't even noticed that it had slid into its firing chamber. The drop pods were literally firing like bullets from a massive belt-fed machine gun. There was a moment of pause before the inertial dampeners caught up to the sudden change in movement. Then we were falling. I could go into detail about what happened in that battle. All the 3 weeks of prolonged on and off combat afterwards. The fact that Ramirez was dead 2 days after landing. The fact that I helped Merrick take an enemy bunker after we'd gotten separated from the rest of the unit during an ambush. The feel of enemy artillery shredding the forest around us as we all huddled in our foxholes, hoping that the Instacrate walls held. Seeing Malik, the only other Colossian in our platoon, lose her left arm trying to throw a grenade back at the enemy. When we finally boarded the transports back up to our ship a month later, I was not the same person I had been at the start. I was tired. I jumped when things startled me. I dove to the ground one day when a machine made a noise that had sounded eerily like a Zanari plasma mortar firing. I didn't sleep. I wasn't alone. Glan turned a shade of blue that I would later learn indicated severe depression. He had to go stay in the medical bay. I didn't see him again for almost 3 months. Most of the unit was in a similar way. The deployment had taken a toll greater than simple injuries and deaths. It had left wounds in our souls. My dreams of glory and honor felt foolish now. The older soldiers, like Merrick, were different. Sure, they'd had attitude shifts too, but this wasn't their first campaign. They'd experienced these feelings before, had a chance to process them, gotten therapy, mourned their own ways. I told SSG Merrick how I felt. He listened. When I was done, when I was on the verge of tears and had mucus coming out of my nasal slits, he leaned forward and put his hand on my shoulder like he had in the pod. "Yrrol, what you're feeling is normal. You had your first taste of real combat. You saw how awful it is, what it can do to your fellow soldiers, and in Mal's case, what it could do to a Colossian, and it's scary." He sat back up and looked at me. His eyes weren't harsh right now. They looked sad. "You know, I've been on 10 different drop deployments. They used to be a lot longer. The TAF only shortened them to a 3-month maximum about 8 years ago. Before that, they could be up to 9. But some genius psychologist realized that they were burning us out. He called it the sacrification of our service members' souls." I remember hearing that phrase and knowing that, even though he'd used some fancy-ass words, he'd nailed it. The TAF changed the standards a little while after. Guess a lot of us troopers agreed with it. "How have you survived all this? 10 deployments, some of them longer than what they are now. I couldn't even think of how horrible a 9-month deployment would be. I've only done 1 month of combat and I feel as though I could go the rest of my life without any more." He smiled a little. "Yeah, you probably could. I know I could." "How'd you handle it?" "I talked to a therapist. Message her at least once a month, though it's been almost daily since we got back aboard the ship." He pulled out his datapad. "I'm going to give you her info. She's not a Colossian like you, but she might be able to help." "Sergeant, how come you humans aren't as affected by this as us non-humans?" "We are, but we figured out PTSD a long time ago. It's as unavoidable as war itself is, and sometimes it's just as unstoppable. But we've gotten better at treating it," he replied. "Go get some rest, Yrrol. Message that doc first thing in the morning. I'll write her right now to let her know what your situation is. You did the right thing coming to talk with me." He opened and led me out of his door. "Thank you, Sergeant. I will." It took a while to begin feeling better again. I spoke to the doctor that Merrick put me in touch with. I still do from time to time. I never truly went back to feeling like the me that had yet to board that drop pod. But eventually, I learned to handle the stresses of combat, both during and after it had finished. SSG Merrick died before he was able to retire. I fought alongside him in 3 more deployments before it happened. He'd been trying to recover a soldier that had been shot in the leg when an explosion vaporized them both. The whole unit ignored his advice about saving the emotions for later and charged the enemy, fury in our hearts for the loss of our leader. He'd have kicked our asses for being that dumb. But we won. I stayed with the 101st for another 7 years, until a bad accident with one of the drop pods caused me to lose a leg. I used to think that Terrans were a warrior society, like mine. I used to idolize great warriors, just like most Qualosian children when they're growing up. I know better now. Humans aren't warriors. They are empaths. They understand emotions like no other race I've met since I left the service. They use their emotional awareness to help others work through theirs. When I'd first met SSG Merrick, I'd been terrified of him. Then, he'd helped me through the most difficult time of my life. Now I lead a group of people like me, warrior culture people who have since learned how terrible war really is. We help those that don't know how to process their emotions, and all I do is talk to them the way I believe SSG Merrick would have.